My name is Sarah Stein. I am a professor of history here, the holder of the Maurice Amato Chair in Sephardic Studies, and a member of the faculty associated with the Center for Jewish Studies. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you tonight, to introduce you to our distinguished guest who really needs no introduction, but it's a pleasure to offer one nonetheless. I want to begin by thanking the sponsors that brought us here, in addition to the Center for Jewish Studies and its indefatigable staff who are represented here, who we thank always for their hard work. Vivian and David here, and Mary and Brianna in the hallway. I also want to thank the Maurice Amato program in Sephardic Studies, the Viterbi program in Mediterranean Studies, and though they were left off of our flyer by mistake, the Center for European and Eurasian Studies. So there we've dispensed with our duties and responsibilities, and we can turn to the tastier part of the menu. It's really a pleasure to introduce you tonight and to welcome Mimi Sheraton, who is the second speaker in our series for the year, Jews and Food. Our first speaker was Jonathan Gold, and we follow up in April with our third speaker, Pupa Dweck, who has authored wonderful cookbooks about Syrian Jewish cuisine. Tonight, Mimi Sheraton joins us, a lifelong New Yorker and truly a legendary food writer. One of the things that is so exciting about Mimi Sheraton is that she traduces and straddles different corners of the food world. Of course, as a food writer, as a cook herself, as someone who has written cultural criticism, scholarly work on the history of food, and someone who's also thought and participated in the aesthetics of featuring food. I'll talk about that in a moment. She has written for nearly every publication in New York that deals with food and is produced in that city. She was the restaurant critic for the New York Times from 1976 until 1984, and for 5 years before joining that institution contributed to the original New York magazine under editor Clay Felker. And it was during that period that she wrote her first big story on things food-ish. I Taste Everything in Bloomingdale's food department, reporting on 1,196 products, a quite daunting start to her food writing career. While traveling around the world for a guidebook to 60 cities called City Portraits, and buying samples of folk art for the George Jensen store in New York, Mimi Sheraton took courses with various cooks and chefs in countries as varied as Denmark, Cambodia, Lebanon, and Turkey, and studied cooking at the China Institute in New York and Le Cordon Bleu in Paris. She has written 16 books, and I'm sure you couldn't avoid but seeing several of them outside for sale. Her book, The Bialy Eaters, from which our food in the back is inspired today, tells of the once vibrant culture of the Polish Jews of the city of Bialystok and the bread that was their principal sustenance. Her book, The Whole World Loves Chicken Soup, won both the IACP and James Beard Awards. Her latest book is a memoir called Eating My Words, An Appetite for Life, which is now in paperback. And it's worth mentioning this very impressive fact that her book, written in 1965, the German cookbook, is still in print, which is a daunting, for any of us who write books, is already an impressive statement. Mimi has also worked as a photographer of food, and her photographs of food markets taken on travels around the world have been exhibited in New York's Leica Gallery in 2002. And in association with this work, she has lectured at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia, on food in still life paintings, a subject that she continues to research currently. It is then a great pleasure to welcome tonight Mimi Sheraton for the second lecture in our series, Jews and Food. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Can you? I don't know if it's better to hold this, but I will. I'm sorry you stopped. I was enjoying the introduction. Wasn't there something else you left out? I'm trying to think. When I was invited to come to this series, David Myers gave me an idea of the schedule for the speakers, and they were hoping I would come in the fall, and there were some other dates, and I said, I will come only if I can come in February, midwinter. I think I had a premonition of what this winter in New York was going to be like. It was 7 degrees when we left New York yesterday morning, so it was quite a treat to be here for many reasons. The question of what is a Jew is an old philosophical question. The question of what is Jewish food is almost equally difficult to answer. In brief, it is, of course, the food of all the countries in which Jews have lived, adjusted somewhat to a very important rule. France had Escoffier, Italy had Pellegrino Artusi, but the Jews had Moses. And he laid down a set of rules that changed cuisines and that kept Jewish housewives doing religious observances all day long, because there are rules for everything, as you well know, related to food. Planning a meal, where you buy it, what you do with it when you get it home, how you cook it, how you serve it, and how you clean up after it. Kind of keeps people performing religious observances the day long. Ashkenazi food came to be known in this country as Jewish food because the Ashkenazi Jews were the main group, the prevalent group, and their food was given that identity. It was, of course, the food of Eastern Europe, Germany and Austria, Russia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, the Ukraine, a little bit but less so Czechoslovakia. And it differed from Sephardic cooking, which I'm sure you all know a lot about, because those Jews lived in the Mediterranean countries. And because of the dietary differences in the cuisine, because Sephardic food is based on olive oil more than fats, because it's more stylish and more vegetables, it's becoming very, very fashionable now, driving out Ashkenazi food in many ways. One of the biggest examples are what we call dairy restaurants, which used to abound in New York, places you went for pierogan, for heavy soups, for lox and onions and eggs. Now the young people go for hummus and falafel, usually pizza, shakshuka, much more of the Middle Eastern and Israeli foods, which are much more healthful. I had the great privilege to co-author a book with Alan King, and he used to say that when he went to Sammy's Romanian Jewish restaurant on the Lower East Side, which I can see by the nodding, some of you have had heartburn there, he said he makes 2 reservations, one at Sammy's and one at Lenox Hill Hospital. And a lot of the food is going out of style. Even delis are not attracting younger people. And many years ago, I was at the Carnegie Deli, and you could sit around there in the afternoon and schmooze with people like Henny Youngman, who looked around the room one day and said, "You know, the average age of the customer here is deceased." And I think that has become the fate of many of the deli restaurants. Of course, not all Ashkenazi food is the same. Not only did the Jews come from different countries, but different towns, different parts of the countries. And Michel Herzog, who was a great Yiddish linguist at Columbia University, did a very interesting series of papers mapping dialects in Eastern Europe related to recipes in Eastern Europe. Galicianers, who were inclined to say bagel and weissmeer instead of bagel and weissmeer, did not put sugar in the gefilte fish. And he has the most interesting charting of occurrences like that, including different names for the same dish just across the border, like across the street in another town, brisket was called one thing and on the other side it was called another. My grandmother made something she called a knish that was not like any knish I had ever seen before or after. It was a big yeast pastry horseshoe, rolled jelly roll style, with a filling of chicken livers, gribenes, sauteed onions, and kasha. And it would be rolled like a jelly roll, bent into a horseshoe, and baked. And like 50 years later, I was invited to an Easter celebration at the home of a Ukrainian woman, a Christian woman, and she said, "Now we have the Easter knish." And she brought out my grandmother's knish. I was stunned, except it was filled with sauerkraut and pork and kasha. But there it was, and I thought, my family never said, my parents never really said where my grandparents came from. In those days, people were not interested in roots. They were interested in Jewish roots, but not national roots. You would say, where did they really come from? And they would say, it was a terrible place. They hated Jews. We're all in America now. Let's not talk about it. And she liked to say they were Austro-Hungarian. And I kept saying, Mother, I think we're Polish. She would say, where did you get that idea? And I got it from some of the food. My paternal grandfather was a rabbi from Prussia. And although he and my mother's parents were very kosher, my mother was not, nor any of her 8 siblings. So I think that generation took a walk from kashruth and just began eating everything as a way of accepting a new country. That I said already. The kosher rules did alter dishes and make them into something completely new. The example I usually give is of the Hungarian chicken paprikash, which was sautéed chicken, usually sautéed in lard, and the sauce was finished with sour cream. Obviously, the Jews had to make some changes, which was chicken fat and no sour cream, which resulted in what we know as chicken fricassee, often with meatballs added to it. And it was quite a different dish without the cream, and a much leaner, clearer dish. In Alsace, even today, there is a specialty called choucroute à la juif, which is the standard choucroute, but beef products, kosher beef, replace the pork. That's in the true Alsatian choucroute. And they also celebrate a fish there, and it's on the menu of many classic Alsatian recipes, carp à la juif. Carp cooked with onions and a lot of parsley and allowed to gel. Carp is a particularly Jewish fish. And when I was young, my grandmother would, as I'm sure many of you have found the same practice, would be swimming in the bathtub until it was time to kill it for the gefilte fish. And a cousin of mine and I were over there one Thursday while the fish was swimming, and my cousin decided that the water was very, very cold. So he would run some hot water in the bathtub to warm the fish, at which point, after a while, the fish just turned over, and my grandmother had to get another one because she wanted a live fish. Some of the iconic foods were, of course, chicken soup, and I never understood why, except that a chicken was very expensive, and the only cheap kind you could get was a very old hen who had passed the laying days and therefore was sold cheaply, and the only thing you could make of it was soup. And that was the standard for Friday night at our house, and so much so that I used to get very impatient, and I used to say to my mother, show me in the Bible where it says that you have to have chicken soup on Friday night, that you can't have pea soup or mushroom and barley soup. It had to be chicken soup. But the point was, chicken soup gave you something to eat the next day, and that was an important point. Schmaltz is an iconic Jewish food. It is thought of as that, and yet schmaltz is a very gourmet ingredient throughout Eastern Europe and Alsace today, but it is usually duck or goose schmaltz. Schmaltz in German refers to any fat, any animal fat, that was rendered, clarified, and resets. They even had butter schmaltz, which they would clarify and use for baking. It produced quite a different effect than something like a pound cake. And of course, Jews, people kid about schmaltz, but it has a very long gourmet history and is even called for in some recipes in Andre Soltner's Lutece cookbook. So that should legitimize it. He's also cracklings, gribbinus. He says, saute duck skin until it's very, very crisp, crush it and sprinkle it on your lentil soup. Well, that's duck gribbinus by another name. Chopped liver. I don't know why chopped liver, except using every part of the animal, and that's a good way to do it. I once saw chopped liver in the shape of the Statue of Liberty at a bar mitzvah, which was very, very special. Blintzes, I think, probably came from all the crepes and palatschinken that are loved in Eastern Europe. They're just folded in a different way. And Jews eat a lot of salt. Why do Jews eat so much salt? Because they grew up in countries where there was a lot of winter, where foods had to be preserved, and so salted down vegetables. Salad in our house in winter was pickled tomatoes, cucumber dill pickles, sauerkraut, and red peppers. Those were vegetables you could eat all year round in winter if you put them up. Fish, herring, you salted it and you kept it all winter. Smoked fish, brine pickled salmon, which was lox, and so you have high blood pressure. And I wonder why everybody in Eastern Europe doesn't have high blood pressure. Ultimately, of course, deli meats are preserved meats. The salted and smoked pastrami, the corned beef, the tongue, all of the hot dogs, and things that were developed as necessities become taste preferences in people who have grown up eating them for a long time. It's why when you travel in the South, if you're with very traditional people, they never eat rare meat. And they never eat rare meat in India because they learned long ago that in hot countries, before there was the kind of preservation and refrigeration we have now, you could get very sick eating rare meat. And the only people I know who ever got sick in India were tourists who insisted on a rare steak and a salad. Bagels. There's a lot of argument as to how the bagel originated. Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett has been working on a book about bagels now for about 10 years. She's a Jewish historian. There seem to be two origins quoted. I myself believe neither one of them. One is that they were developed along the Silk Road, that they had a roll that you boiled first and then baked. That is the unique feature of the bagel. Not that it is round, because everybody, every culture that bakes eventually bakes a ring, whether it's a ring-shaped cake or a ring-shaped bread for various practical reasons. But the feature of the bagel is that it is boiled before it bakes, so it stays soft inside. And they said Jewish merchants picked it up along the Silk Road and brought it to Eastern Europe. The other story is that it was created at the Siege of Vienna when the Turks were defeated. The Jewish bakers were so grateful that they baked a bread in the shape of something called the boigel, which was a stirrup. And they did it to honor John Sobieski. After I wrote that, I had a letter from a scholar up at Yale who said the Jews hated Sobieski so much that I can't believe they baked anything in honor of him. That was also the origin of the croissant. So the Siege of Vienna really gave us a lot of things to have with our coffee. That was the Viennese bakers baked something in the shape of a crescent, which they had, it's the mark of the Turkish flag, which they had defeated. But I don't know where to get a good bagel, even in New York. When I was a kid, you ate a bagel not more than 4 hours after you bought it because it turned to stone. If you chewed it, your jaw muscles vibrated for the rest of the day. The newer generations don't want it that way. They want shelf life, they want it soft, and they don't like things darkly baked. I've had this discussion, we can get to bialys in a minute, but with the people at Kosar's, we like well-done bialys. It's very hard to pick them out that way. They said the younger generation likes them pale. They don't like them dark brown, and they don't like them hard. And since I've long had a feeling that the younger generation really likes a fillet of life, I can understand why they want soft bagels. The only Jewish food that I can find that really has been consistent in all groups is the matzah, for obvious reasons. I think that's the only way to fulfill the biblical requirement, and the form works. In Italy, they did have at certain times around Tuscany very decorative stamps that they would put on their matzahs, but the basic matzah was the same. And of course they're quite different if you get the shmura matzah. That's an adventure. We went once in New York, my husband and I, and we took my mother because she spoke Yiddish, and these were made by all the Hasidic groups who spoke mostly Yiddish. And to watch those, I don't know how many of you have ever had the privilege of watching them bake shmura matzah, but it was something. All the volunteers working, and every 17 minutes a whistle blew, and they had to stop because they didn't want fermentation to set in, and they figured that took 19 minutes, so they stopped in 17 minutes, and they would go through yelling matzah, and they would pick up all the half-rolled matzahs. They were round and rolled with rolling pins, and put them in the oven, and I tried to convince them that they could use the oven for pizzas the rest of the year, but they didn't want to hear that. They didn't use it for anything else. But for really iconic food, for what I now think of as the Jewish Madeleine, there's nothing quite like the bialy. I had loved them for years, and the old bakeries in New York used to call themselves Bialystok Kuchen bakeries. And that gave me the idea that they came from Bialystok. And I was going to Poland for the Condé Nast Traveler, was part of a trip to Eastern Europe to write about food. And I said to my husband, let's take a side trip to Bialystok and see if there are any bialys. And I did some advanced research in New York. I went to the Bialystok, a home for the aged, where there was a very interesting man who was a Bialystoker. And I said, I'm going to Bialystok, do you know anyone? He said, why are you going? I said, I'm going to look for bialys. He said, but Kosars is around the corner. Why are you going so far? But he did give me some wonderful contacts, and we set out with a car and driver from Warsaw to go to Bialystok. It was raining and snowing and miserable in late November. The town was just one blob of mud. I must say, before I deride Bialystok, that it has improved greatly. I know people who have been since, and they now have a place called New York Bagels. So we know that they're onto the right thing. As a result of that trip, and we went all over seeking anyone in the town who might know, we found one Christian baker who made a soft roll. It was kind of like a hamburger bun, with a piece of cheese in the center. And he said his parents told him Jewish bakers used to make a certain roll that everybody liked, even non-Jews, and the closest he could come was that there was something special going on in the center. Not knowing what it was, he put a piece of cheese. So it did not taste at all like any bialys we ever knew. I came back from that trip, and I wrote an article for the English language edition of The Forward, and for a publication that may have escaped your notice called the Bialystoker Stimme, which was published by the Bialystok Home for the Aged and went to Bialystok landslides all over the world. It was half written from the front to the middle in English and from the back to the middle in Yiddish. As a result of those two articles, I got letters from Argentina, Australia, Israel, Paris, all over the United States, from former Bialystokers who just thought of that roll, which they had never found again, which they always longed for, and which, like the Madeleine, invoked very, very strong memories of this place where they had grown up. Some of the people had become very prominent. The international lawyer Samuel Pizar, who I interviewed in his gorgeous home in Paris, Max Ratner, who is one of the sponsors of the film we've seen, Forest City Enterprises, who are rapidly destroying New York and the Atlantic Yards in Brooklyn by building buildings nobody wants. But he loved Bialystok and talked about it, and he lived in Cleveland, but he had bialy sent from Kosar. And one of the most interesting people was Leo Melamed, the chairman emeritus of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, who was an avid Bialystoker, and he spoke, a very elegant man, telling me about bialys and how his grandmother used to give him the tail piece of the herring because you could hold it up by the tail and just bite it without a fork and knife. And to see this really elegantly tailored man who, with Milton Friedman, had created the international money market, was just, the food took him back, and he was no longer the head of the Mercantile Exchange. He was a 7-year-old kid in Bialystok who was one of the people saved by the Japanese consul Sugihara, who, because they had gone to Lithuania and then were evacuated finally through Vladivostok to Japan, and then came to New York and then went to Chicago. This was all just from remembering a roll. We interviewed many interesting people in Israel. One man who, a construction man who had been from Bialystok and lived now in Gedera in Israel, who had a Yemenite baker who made a kind of pita that sort of reminded a Wiener dog lippe of kuchen, which is what they were called in Bialystok. And many people have told me that bialys are American. What was not known in Bialystok was that name. They were known as kuchen. Bialystoker kuchen, and the people who ate them, the people of Bialystok, were known as Bialystoker kuchenfressers by all of the people in the surrounding communities. And he taught this Yemenite baker to make bialys, and he would order them for a very unusual event that took place about 3 times a year in Israel. There were 400 Esperanto speakers in Israel at that time, which was 1996, I think, because Esperanto was invented in Bialystok by an ophthalmologist named Dr. Zamenhof. And these Esperanto speakers would get together, and Lipa would bring Bialystoker kuchen. And when I called from New York to the town of Kfar Saba, where one of these former Bialystokers who had written to me lived, his wife said, "He will not speak to you if you don't speak Esperanto." So I thought, there's a man who doesn't speak to many people. And he had all sorts of translations, even of bialy. Kuchoi was how you say, if you're ever in need of it, kuchoi is how you order bialys in Esperanto. I would like very much now to show you a film of life in Bialystok, Jewish life in Bialystok in 1939. It's a especially poignant time when you think of this as a summer film and the beautiful life, and September 1939, Hitler marched into Poland. So if we can see the film.
verhältnismäßiger Junggestuss. Am wurde so gewesen, ein gut polnische Schlacht gibt's so gut Branitzki. Der hat das ein gut gemachter Stott. Noch jünger israelischer Jeschuh in Bialystok. Sag hat ihn der aus kurz 200 Jahre. Wir befinden sich im tiefsten Zentrum in der Stadt. Das ist das Rothaus. Den Seiger auf dem Rothausturm hat gemacht der jüdische Seigermacher Aid a größer Land. Gefährlich 80 jüdische Krummen mit gegenüber bialysischen Futter zusammen in einige.
That's just what the market looked like when we went there. Old pots and pans.
die Feuer mit ihrer Vorrecht zu verbeuten ihre Produkten. Geben Sie Unternutzer. Der junge indische Klempner greift sich zu werden, als kommen die Chefit oder Menuchim. Wenn sie wohl nicht wissen, gewinnt schon an unsere Sachen. Das ist die alte Schule. Die weibliche Schule hat zugebracht, die ist Bialystok.
Several thousand Jews were burned to death in that synagogue when the Germans came in. The dome is now a monument in the middle of the city.
Cuisine. In dem heute ist geboren geworden und hat gelebt lange Jungen der Chef auf den Esperanto Dr. Gamelhoff. Das ist der Polkoweier Besamedrich. Heißt der Pfarr und der Volkssoldaten hat gespielt beim Chanukka Versagen zu Besamedrich. In der Maleisenbibliothek werden vermocht 20.000 jüdische Bücher.
Printing was one of the big industries there.
Die werden es lernen 600 Schüler.
Textiles was one of the big business of Jews, and they developed a special fabric known as Bialystok tuk, a wool used for coating, for coats. A lot of them went to Argentina, established a town called Bialystok, and brought textile machinery with them. That was the basis of Argentine textile industry. center of the Bund movement, and there were many charitable organizations to protect people.
Du bist die Leitung von der Kolonie. Du haben die jüdische Uhr mit Kindern und Ämtern der Eiden. Heute von Essen der Jüdische der Saft. Tut es gut zu die Kinder. Wir sehen die zukünftigen Schönheiten, mit welchen Bialystok ist Berlin.
Jews still like to lie in the sun, don't they? Now, here's a child eating a Bialystok kuchen, which is what they were called. Many people said to me, "You mean a pretzel?" I said, "No, I don't mean a pretzel, because the mark of the bialy is that center. And it is pressed and stretched, so ideally it should be crisp, while the rim remains soft." My theory on how it happened is that a pretzel baker had one fall on the floor and accidentally stepped on it with his heel, thereby pressing down the center. And not wanting to waste money, he said, "Let's bake it off and see what happens." And so the bialy was born. And there they are, eating them in Bialystok. Thank you, David.
Bialystoker Geschmack und Kuchen.
Geschmack. That's a very big one. They were almost 9 inches round.
Der heutige erste Bialystoker Pretzel. Wie ihr seht, ist von dieser Appetit zu. Und zum Schluss der Sheran Fall. Amul ist es gewesen, der Guten zum Bialystok-Palast. Spazieren du zwischen die Blumen Bialystoker Mädel, erfuhren wir wegen reicher Amerikaner gefallen. Ein Amerikaner Boy ist somit gewunden. Als ich zu und kommt daher, ihr wird mich verweilen.
There were only 5 Jews left in Bialystok when we were there, and buildings had freshly painted on them Juden Raus. Interesting that it was written in German in a Polish city. New buildings, post-war, post-Holocaust. Many Polish Jews escaped through Bialystok, since it was right across the border from Belarus, and joined the Russian army. Not all of the Jews missing from Bialystok were killed. Some escaped through that city. One of the most interesting letters I had came from Melbourne, Australia. A very long letter from a man called Pesach Shmuz, whose family had been bialy bakers, and he described the whole routine, how the father and the brothers stayed up all night baking the bialys. They went to sleep in the morning, and the women came down, the mother and the sister, and sold the bialys in the shop. He remembered the names of all of the bialy bakers and the streets they were on. He said there was Moshe Griska on Mazioska Street, and Piaskos Longnose on Zelazna Street, and Sholem Maike on Sosnovna Street. I remembered every bialy baker in Bialystok. And in Argentina, I actually interviewed a former bialy baker who wanted to bake them in Argentina, but his wife thought that it was very low-class work and she didn't want him to be a baker. But Pesach Shmu's letter to me ended this way. He said, in June 1941, the Nazis came to us, and since then, there are no more Bialystok Kuchen, no more Kuchen bakeries, no more Bialystok Jews. Poland was the only country where young Jews were killed after the war. I don't forgive the Nazis, but I don't forgive the Poles either. When the Nazis came to Bialystok on June 27, 1941, Poles showed them where the Jews lived, and Poles robbed the Jews' houses. The Nazis did not build Auschwitz. Oh, I'm sorry. The Nazis did not build Auschwitz, Treblinka, or Majdanek in France, Belgium, or Holland. They built them in Poland because they knew the Poles would help them kill the Jews. The Poles were partners in our destruction. And so much for an iconic food. So if anyone has questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. Questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes?
Is Kosar's the only place that's left that's truly...
There's one in Brooklyn called Bell, and there have become a few new ones in Brooklyn around Avenue M and 15th Street, which is very near where I grew up. I haven't tried that one, but Bell's have never been really good, and Kosar's is not as good as it used to be. It was bought by new people who put in some modern manufacturing methods that spoiled them a little, making... Yes?
And you know what they charge per bialy? 90 cents.
Well, you know, there's a story about that. A man went to Kosar's and said how much at the Bialys, and at that time they were a quarter. And he said, well, the man across the street is selling them for 15 cents. He says, so buy them across the street. So the man says, but he's out of them today. He says, oh, well, when I'm out of Bialys, they're 15 cents a piece, too. Now they're 90 cents?
90 cents.
Yes?
Was the Max Ratner there, the one that started Ratner's in New York?
No, he's the man who started Forest City Enterprises. By the time he came to this country, he had two brothers in the lumber business in Cleveland, and he joined them, and out of that came this enormous real estate developer. Yes?
When did the onions was still killing the bialys? My always association.
You mean when did they put them on?
Yeah.
Just before they put them in the oven.
Yes, but you never talked about the filling being with onions.
Onions and poppy seeds. In Bialystok, poppy seeds were very, very important. Samuel Pizar told me you had to get every single poppy seed. You had to press your finger down on the plate or on the paper to get up every poppy seed. They always had onions because, as I say, it developed from a pretzel, and they should be freshly chopped onions, and they rarely are now. They're often dehydrated, which have a terrible taste. So that's, and poppy seeds are not used now. At Kosar, they put poppy seeds on the garlic bialys to differentiate them so the salespeople will know garlic from onion bialys. So I said, why didn't you put the poppy seeds on the onion bialys and not on the garlic? They said, because we make many more onion bialys and poppy seeds are expensive. So they put them on the ones that they made fewer of. Yes, Sarah?
In a way, it is surprising that bialys didn't remain in Bialystok after the Holocaust, because I would have expected that non-Jews would have patronized the bakeries, and maybe even you could imagine a non-Jewish apprentice in a Jewish bakery. So do you find it surprising?
They could never have figured it out. I don't know that anybody wanted to, at that point. Maybe it was something Jews did, and Jews were no longer there, and they were eating other things. I don't know why they didn't, or certainly the 5 Jews who were left weren't going to do it. So I just couldn't figure out why they never had good ones in Israel. They didn't sell them anywhere, or or even in Los Angeles, if I may say so. The only bialy I ever bought here was at something called a Broadway deli, and it looked as though it was made by Rubbermaid. It probably tasted that way too. Yes?
I come from Poland, and I never heard of bagels. Bagels, I thought was always American.
Bagels, no. Bagels were all over Europe and in different forms. In Turkey they had sesame seeds, and they were in Poland and Russia.
Maybe they were different shape, is that possible?
No, a bagel, the only thing left of the bagel is the shape, I've decided. The only thing left of the bagel is the hole. Yes?
I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, but my in-laws liked something, it was like a cookie, a kugel, it's tasteless. And you know what, the one I mean?
Tasteless?
It's like chocolate chip. I pronounce it. I don't, it's just a dry, everything comes, no taste.
I don't know what it is. I don't remember anything Jewish being tasteful. If anything, it had too much taste. Was it a cookie?
It's still round.
What does it look like? Oh, yeah, rather dry egg pastry with sugar on. But you're supposed to have wine with that or coffee, so it's supposed to be almost like an Italian biscotti. You know, very neutral, and you can dip it in wine. I love those. And you can get them in big boards, too. A big kihel. Yes?
I have a question about two things that my different Russian Jewish grandmothers made. One is cholent. Could you say something about that? And the other thing is, one of my grandmothers, who was a wonderful baker, used to make a chocolate cake with sour cream, which I think only once at one really gourmet restaurant I have ever had anything as good as chocolate cake. So I wondered if you could talk about that.
I don't recall anything chocolate as being part of Jewish baking. Of all the traditional Jewish baking I know, except maybe marble cake.
But sour cream was, right? They used sour cream.
Well, it would depend. A lot of baking was parov, so they could serve it after dessert, especially a fancy cake like a chocolate cake. I can't remember anything that fancy being made with a dairy product, so maybe it was a later development. Cholent, of course, was a very religious effective thing because you weren't supposed to cook on Saturday and you put it in the oven. And by the way, they were put in the ovens of many Bialystok bakeries. When they couldn't bake on Friday night, they would charge people a quarter a pot to bring their cholent down, and then they could come up and pick it up on Saturday.
What's in it?
Yes?
Is babka an American dish?
It's a Russian dish. Babka is Russian, and there's a babka in Italian too. But I think the babka you're talking about is a Russian-Polish cake. Yeah, which the Jews brought here with them. Yes?
So you said something about not having a lot of chocolate. And rugelach or not?
Chocolate rugelach, I guarantee you are American. Rugelach, chopped nuts, cinnamon, sugar, maybe apricot jam, but not chocolate. I just never heard it as any part of European Jewish. Maybe they would eat a piece of chocolate. And by the way, in Bialystok, they ate halva with bialys. There was a shop there by a Turkish man, a very expensive halva shop. And I said to one woman who told me, I said, eating halva with a bialy, wasn't it dry? She said, we choked. But they ate it and they drank it with something called buza, which I think was maybe like ouzo, a milky white licorice-flavored drink that the shop was called the Macedonian in the middle of Bialystok. It was very expensive, and it indicated that Bialystok was a thriving town to be able to support a sweet shop like that. Yes?
First of all, apropos of what you just said, I had an uncle who was raised by a very Russian mother, and he made halva sandwiches all the time, and made us eat them too. Not good.
Did you choke?
Yes. Very
But here you are, I'm glad.
I wanted to ask you, what is the traditional way fixing the bialy to eat? It's not like a bagel with
Well, I'll
cream
tell you, you don't split it the way we do. However, all of the Bialystokers I spoke to regarded that as a travesty. If you were going to spread anything on it, you were supposed to spread it on the bottom side, but not lose poppy seeds. They didn't spread a lot on it. They said they didn't have a lot of money and they couldn't afford to, and some of the people bought them in the street. There used to be vendors who would take them from the bakery hot. They had to be hot. Nobody ever bought a cold bialy in Bialystok. And the kids would eat them on their way to school and just be happy to have the bialy without spreading anything on it, except halva if they were rich. Yes? Gentlemen?
Was kreplach originated by Jews or did they borrow it?
Chinese wontons. I don't know. No, I think there is in Germany and all over Europe a little dumpling of dough wrapped around a meat filling. And, you know, like a ravioli, a tortellini. In German it would be called Maultaschen, a mouth pocket.
But they're not as good.
Excuse me?
They're not as good as the Jewish kreplach.
I think the wontons are pretty good, but you know, the whole subject is why the Jews like Chinese food, and that's one of the answers. Yeah?
What's the difference between a tzimmus and a cholent, and they have different countries of origin?
Well, as far as I know, tzimmus, in anything I heard, wasn't really so much meat and beans and eggs and everything cooked overnight in a slow oven. What my family called tzimmus had nothing to do with what anybody else called tzimmus. It was a mix of kohlrabi, carrots, string beans, onions, mushrooms if you had them. It's much closer to what the Germans call Leipziger allerlei. They called it tzimmus because it had so much in it. It was a big tzimmus.
So was it sweet? Would there be a sweet tzimmus and a savory tzimmus?
I don't know. The sweet one we just never had, and I really don't like it. It was sweet potatoes and prunes and meat and carrots. I can't tell you much about it. Yes?
I'm curious about the Jewish delicatessen as it exists in America today. Is that how much of that was an old world institution, and how much was
well, putting it together that way in a deli, I think, was American Jewish, but all of those things existed separately throughout Eastern Europe. They were preserved meats. I mean, Italy, France, everybody has a salami, you know, a sausage, and the smoked meats like pastrami, which I think was basically Turkish, where it's called basturma. And then Romanian. And the story was that a Romanian Jew introduced pastrami to New York. I think his name was Volk, V-O-L-K, who brought it to New York. His daughter recently wrote a book about it. Yes?
My parents used to like borscht. Whatever happened to that? Is that Russian or Jewish?
Borscht is Russian. What could be more Russian? But, you know, there are many kinds. There was cold beef borscht, there was hot beef borscht, there was cabbage borscht, but definitely Russian, Polish, and the Jews from those countries brought them here.
I just want you to know that you were a clue on Jeopardy last night.
Last night?
Yeah.
What?
There was a Jeopardy
Now I've
last
made
night
it.
that said, according to Mimi Sheraton, and I don't remember the rest of it.
Oh, Jane, you're my cousin and you don't remember.
We can't go on. But yeah.
I'm going to call them and ask them. I know I've been in the Times crossword puzzle 3 times. That's exceptional. Yes?
Yeah, my grandmother used to make something she called zemla, which was well, no, it was a big pastry though with jelly running through it.
And it was called what?
Zemla.
I don't know that. I don't know that. Yeah?
What's with Jews and poppy seed?
I can't hear you.
What's with Jews and poppy seed?
What's with Jews? Because they were all over Eastern Europe. It was a great, I mean, poppy seed strudel is one of the great Austrian strudels. And so I guess, you know, they would put it in Hammentaschen, and they like all sorts of poppy seed cake, which you're not supposed to eat before you take a drug test, because you test positive for opium. So don't eat a Hammentaschen before you have a blood test. Yeah?
So when did bialys arrive in the United States, and what was the geographic scope of bialy trade? Was it limited to the Lower East Side, East End, Uptown, outer boroughs?
The Bronx around Jerome Avenue was a very big center, and the Lower East Side, and I think around 1910 was when the people who came began making them. One of the most interesting letters I received came from Professor Roy Mirsky, who was head of the Tarleton Law Library at the University of Texas in Austin. He wrote me a long letter because his father had been a partner in the original Kosars. It was called Mirsky and Kosar. And this very dignified, very Texan law professor told me he used to ride on the truck every weekend and jump off the truck, leaving the baskets of bialys at the various retail shops so they would be there when he opened. And he said, I used to ride in the truck backwards, and the smell of the onions and the yeast, and you can get a little of it now, so imagine being enclosed in a truck with it. He said, used to nauseate him. He used to have to jump off. And we went down to Austin to meet him, and there he was in jeans and with the leather bolo tie, and he looked all the world for a Texan, and all he could talk about was growing up on the Lower East Side as an owner of Kosar. It was one of the wonderful letters that came in. Yes?
Okay, what's the origin of barley?
I don't know the origin, but it's just like biscotti, and my mother always made it. I don't know. I'm sure it was a German, Austrian, Hungarian cake that Jews learned to make. Yes?
Yeah, well, this is more of a historical question, sociocultural. In Bialystok, the village looks like it had been created by the Count and the Countess. What was the history there?
Well, the Count and the Countess wanted to encourage the Jews to stay there and protected them, and so they built many things from. David may know a little more about the history of why the Count and Countess Bernsky encouraged the Jews and supported them in staying in Bialystok.
Well, I actually don't know about the case of the Count and the Countess, but very often it was the case that the ruler or sovereign or local noble invited the Jews as a body into a particular locale in order to provide benefit from their presence. They could be moneylenders, they could be purveyors of liquor, they could provide other services that were Jewish-specific vocations, and in return they received protection, physical protection. So I actually don't know the case of this Count and Countess, but that's a very common story. That's how Jews settled in Eastern Europe, extending back to the late 13th century.
They were very big in the industries, not only of textiles, but leather, lumber, and printing, with 4 big Jewish industries in Bialystok. Yes?
How did you start your career in the food industry?
By eating. Sort of that, in food-oriented family, going into journalism, gradually working over to food. My first field was interior design, and I wrote about that for 10 years. But I loved food, and it was a hobby, and so I was writing for magazines, and I began writing about food because you could go to more places. And I've used it to get to a lot of places.
Okay. Well, we thank Mimi Sheraton for a wonderful